welcome Laura Cunningham.
Yeah, great, thank you. And thanks for inviting me. I think I've talked to a couple of other CNPS chapters around the state. Well, at the Tilden Botanic Garden, the East Bay chapter, and then the San Fernando Valley chapter. So, and you guys have been great. This is like one of my favorite groups to talk to. So, is that better? So, this is a talk about this book that's taken me 20 years to research and write, and the talk is about how California has changed over the past several thousand years, and it's also a little bit of a talk on how to write a book, how to write a really large book. So I grew up in the East Bay, the El Cerrito, Kensington, Berkeley area, lived there quite a long time, and got out and explored a lot of the state of California before now. Actually, I'm living in Nevada because I married a park ranger in Death Valley National Park. So, see how this works. There, okay, got it. So, a lot of these, I'm a self-taught artist and just read a lot of books, went to museums, and taught myself oil painting, sketching. And what I would do is, I knew I wanted to write this book even as a kid about what California looked like before the cities. Even when I was a kid walking to school, I would wonder what were the hills like now that have all the houses and cars on them. And for instance, in my imagination, I would think, on the left there is a blue oak covered hillside with purple needlegrass and a grizzly bear trail going up to the oaks. And then on the right is a pastel of a coast live oak. And if you had been back in time walking through our Bay Area hills, you might have come across an oak trunk that had this huge rub on it, which is where a grizzly bear might have rubbed its back, because they get itchy backs. So a lot of rocks and tree trunks might have had this type of scar on it. So growing up in the El Cerrito Hills area, I would go to Tilden Wildcat Regional Park, great place to be a kid and to start seeing changes. And this is Wildcat Creek, a series of little oil sketches I did out in the field looking at the changes through the seasons of this creek. But as I was observing this creek, I would go hike down to it every weekend. And over the years, you begin to see changes that you don't see just in seasons. You begin to see changes that happen, like things that only happen once every 10 years. So it's really valuable to be in one place for a long time and start seeing these long-term changes. So for instance, on the top left is Wildcat Creek in a typical summer. It's often an intermittent creek and it will go down low. But then there have been drought years, not as bad as today, this year, but there have been drought years where I would go down and the creek didn't flow most of the year. And even as a younger person, I wondered, where did the fish go? They're little native sticklebacks and rainbow trout fry. And then in the winter, typical winter, lower left, the creek is much higher. But if anyone has lived here a long time in the Bay Area and remembers 1981-82, we had an extreme strong El Nino. And that year I painted this on the lower right. Wildcat Creek was raging and flash flood. I'd never seen it so monstrous. It was just full of muddy water. It took out a little footbridge. It flooded the nature area visitor center at Tilden Park. And then when this floodwater went down, I went down to the creek and the flood had actually scoured the creek down 2 feet. I mean, and overnight the creek bed dropped. So I began to see there's changes are happening. So here's a photograph I took of where I grew up in the El Cerrito Hills, and it's actually in Kensington, looking out towards Mount Tam and Richmond. And what I wanted to do is teach myself how to paint. And what did this particular scene look like, say, 200 years ago, before the urban areas? So this is my interpretation, an oil painting I did of the same view. There's Mount Tamalpais, and then over the left is the Golden Gate in San Francisco, the peninsula, on the far left. And the hills would have been covered, I think, in pure grassland up here where my house was, purple needlegrass, flocks of western meadowlarks. And you could have walked along the ridges in a soft sea breeze during a sunset, and you would have had all these purple needlegrass stems probably brushing against your legs. And if you had gone down to the Albany mudflats back then, you might have seen a scene like this, a beached gray whale with grizzlies feeding on it.
I like the grizzly coming out.
There, you know that, very observant, because that's based on, there was a report in the, I think it was the 1840s, of a naturalist in Monterey Bay, early California history, and he reported seeing a beached gray whale that had grizzlies. They had eaten a hole into it and were going inside the whale, feeding on it. So San Francisco, this was a little bit more difficult to try to imagine what this scene looked like. So this is looking down towards downtown, looking east towards Oakland, Berkeley. So I would try to gather a lot of clues as to what the evidence was of what this scene looked like. And walking through San Francisco, you can sometimes just pick out interesting evidence. This was O'Farrell Street. They were digging it up for some reason. And I noticed that under the cement asphalt, there was sand. It was pure sand. And as a lot of you probably know, a lot of San Francisco is sand hills. But even under that, I don't have a pointer, but there's bricks. It was like the original brick street, and they just covered it up with a new street. So you can actually see the history under the street. So trying to imagine what that one scene was like, and then doing an oil painting of, say, 500 years ago. This is how I interpret that view. Downtown would have been on that little bay shore. A lot of that was landfill. They just dumped landfill. Bad idea, because the earthquake of 1906 really, it was not a good place to put buildings. So a lot of the plants I was interpreting would be there are things like California sagebrush, some fescue bunchgrasses, blue blossom ceanothus, and then there's some elk antlers shed by elk, because there were early reports of elk. And in Oakland, today, Lake Merritt, what was it like in the past? It was actually a saltwater inlet of the bay that they had just simply dammed, and it created a freshwater lake. And this is where I grew up, El Cerrito Plaza, East Bay. This is a parking lot now, a lot of shops. And that's Albany Hill in the background, covered with blue gum eucalyptus, which were imported decades ago because people thought it would be a good timber tree. It turned out to be very brittle, but it loved our Mediterranean climate and has stayed. In the past, there's clues. El Cerrito has kind of a neat historical system where they've put these maps on the sidewalk. So as you walk down San Pablo Avenue, you come across these neat little bits of history. And I took a picture of this one because it's a great clue as to how to reconstruct that El Cerrito Plaza. In the 1830s, during the Mexican land grant era, there were these huge ranchos, hundreds of thousands of acres, and they didn't have fences. So they drew little maps, and they actually drew all the hills and little oak woodlands and creeks and marsh edges, and it's like a great resource for what the early details look like. So this one has Albany Hill. It shows a little creek next to it, Cerrito Creek, and some of them even show willow copses, and they call them sowsows. So it's quite a detailed bit of information. So using that, I thought that parking lot might have looked like this, say 1,000 years ago. Grizzlies feeding on fallen acorns from a coast live oak. And there's Albany Hill in the background with grass. So what I would do is go to a certain place, this is Mission Santa Barbara, and take photographs and then try to reconstruct an oil painting of the same scene, same skyline and hills. This one was pretty easy because there's a lot of written material going back to the 1700s of the missionaries coming, and they described the site, and they wanted to know what was the grazing like, how many trees, the creeks. So you have kind of a neat, really early description of what this place was like. They said, for instance, there was a lot of bunchgrasses burned off by the Indians, and then they would say things like, there was a grass that was very tall, and it was as tall as the saddle on a horse, if you're a man on a horse. And so you go there, and I would visit Santa Barbara and look around the hills, and you see like there is a giant wild rye, Elemus condensatus. I was joking with my sister, who is a CNPS member in the East Bay, that now that I'm in Nevada, I cannot keep up with the scientific names. And if you look at this book, I have purple needlegrasses, Nazella, because it had changed. And then, of course, now it's back to stipa. So, and that's okay. So anyway, moving into the San Joaquin Valley, this is near Fresno, the Friant Dam on the San Joaquin River. What was it like in the past? Possibly like this, full of salmon, migrating far up into the southern Sierras. And then in Southern California, this is San Fernando Valley. And it was kind of fun to hike up into these hills, and it's really nice south coastal sage scrub, and there's a lot of remnant plants growing right on the edge of this city. So what was this place like back in the past? Possibly like this. Huge, giant grizzlies roaming all over the hills in Southern California. Now it's kind of neat. I'm always trying to gather evidence to correct myself. These are just like hypotheses, these paintings. They're like, I'm not sure, no one knows what California was like 1,000 years ago. So I'm always trying to find more evidence. And this was kind of neat because I was actually giving a talk to a San Fernando Valley, I think it was an Audubon group. And afterwards, a fellow came up to me and said, well, my grandmother was born in San Fernando Valley, and she did watercolor paintings when she was really young. And I had wondered if there were trees in that plain. I had read some accounts that said it was pretty open and grassy. But it was interesting because he said all of her paintings from before the city were just wildflower fields, just open grassland. So he said, your painting seems to, reflect that. So that was great to hear. So, let's see. Yeah, this is the one on the board. So the field work I use for trying to collect all this evidence, I try to get like sketches, I take sketchbooks out there, I take little paint boxes, cameras, and then I do a lot of library research. That's really important. Old maps, old photographs, old paintings. And I go into the field. This is my sister and I walking around Richmond, and we're actually finding a little purple needlegrass bunch just out in a little open lot. And in the East Bay, there's creeks that you can still find that haven't been covered. And then I take all of this material, my field sketches and photographs and notes, and I go back into my studio and make little sketches, little tiny thumbnail sketches of the bigger paintings I want to use. Then I take a pencil and do larger illustrations. And these are good because I can send these off to experts. Now this is the Delta, North Delta, with the Sacramento River flowing into it. And I don't have a pointer, but the Maidu Indian village there, I sent that off to an anthropologist, and he said, change the architecture to have more varied buildings. So this is a further rendering in color, and I was able to vary the architecture. So then I take that information and do larger oil paintings. So in the book, I wanted to start with some of the charismatic megafauna that we used to have in the state. And the grizzly, that's one of the more interesting critters that we have in California that we used to have, that's now extinct. So instead of going to zoos, I wanted to go to places like Yellowstone National Park and actually try to do field sketches and watch wild grizzlies in a big wilderness area. So these are sketches of actually wild grizzlies, and you've heard of bird watchers. There's apparently bear watchers, and so we would all get in our cars, go early in the morning and park along highways, and for safety, kind of keep next to the car because these guys are big, and get our spotting scopes out and our binoculars. And so these are field sketches done through binoculars and of distant bears roaming through the hills. And it was really interesting. It gave me a feel for what California might have been like with these huge carnivores roaming the hills. Here's just a pen and ink sketch of our early California grizzly in a bunchgrass field. So I tried to figure out, well, what did California grizzlies eat? What was their ecology? And apparently they ate just about everything. They liked manzanita berries, blackberries. Actually, they were called bear berries early on for a good reason. They grazed on clover, grass, green grass. They used their very long claws to dig up wild onion bulbs, brodia bulbs. They would flip over stones to get grubs. They would dig up ground squirrels and gophers. And they were large enough that they would run down and kill a bull elk, which is as large as a horse. So they must have been a real force in the ecosystem. Here's an oil painting of grizzlies fishing for salmon along the Sacramento River. And here's a sketch of these claws, which are incredible. Sometimes they were like 6 inches long, and they mostly used them for digging. But then they were gone. Grizzlies were not compatible with civilization moving into California. So they were mostly just shot out by ranchers. And it's interesting how the last grizzly might have died and where. There's 2 possibilities. The last grizzly was seen as late as 1924, I think it is. It's kind of amazing that we had grizzlies in California in the 1920s. One was last seen and shot in the southern Sierra Nevada, but there's another contender for the last one in the Los Padres National Forest, the South Coast Range. So elk are the really common hoof stock that we used to have over most of the state. They must have been abundant right here in San Jose area, Bay Area. And the elk we had are the Tule elk in this area, and they are from the Southern California area, up the coast, up the Central Valley. The Roosevelt elk was in the North Coast, the Redwood Zone, and then we had Rocky Mountain elk in the northeastern Great Basin sagebrush zone. Here's an oil painting of an elk herd this is actually, I painted this near Sunol, the Sunol Regional Wilderness. Sacramento, the state capital. What did it look like in the past? Or possibly like this, a marshy native grassland with giant valley oaks and herds of elk and pronghorn antelope. There were so many elk in the Sacramento Valley that they would collect their shed antlers and make fences out of them. And one herd was seen that the count was apparently 1,000 elk. Pronghorn antelope also were all over the entire state, including the Bay Area. And I put this in because some people have asked, well, why are pronghorn antelope among some of the fastest animals in North America? I mean, they've been clocked at over 50 miles per hour. I mean, they just are incredibly fast. And we did have a native cheetah in the Ice Age prior to 10,000 years ago there were native cheetahs right here in California. So there might have been a predator that could actually match the pronghorn antelope in speed, because nothing can catch it now. Here's a pencil drawing of a male pronghorn antelope. Some of the predators that are still with us: bobcats, mountain lions, coyotes. These are some field sketches I did of coyotes. But we had other predators in the past. The wolf. This is a oil painting of a single white wolf up in what is now Yosemite National Park. And when I wrote the book, I was doing a lot of research, but I never thought that an event would happen in my lifetime. The wolf reintroduced itself to California. I mean, you've probably seen some of the news that, interestingly, some of the same wolves that I might have sketched back in the 1990s in Yellowstone when I was researching the book reproduced, and packs, the pups formed new packs, and they moved westward through Idaho, and then some packs established in northeastern Oregon. Well, a year or two ago, and this just amazed me, a single male wolf made a beeline, left Oregon, went all the way through the state, and entered the California boundary around Mount Shasta, Mount Lassen. And I think he's still wandering around. They have him, they're tracking him. I think he's radio collared, and he has a name. And
that's pups.
Okay, good. That's all right. Good to hear. Okay. I'm in Nevada. It's hard to keep track of these California wolves. But so that's really, it was interesting that I wrote this book. It was published in 2011, and I just never thought that we'd have wild wolves entering California so soon. It was really interesting. So here's some field sketches I did of wild wolves in Yellowstone National Park back in the 1990s. And again, us bear watchers would get up early in the morning before dawn and park our cars along the roads there, get our spotting scopes out, and once in a while you'd see a lone wolf. You'd hear a howl in the distant forest, and then a wolf would come out. This one came out into this meadow and caught up a vole, a little meadow mouse, and just started playing with it like a cat. And then another day, we got a report that the pack had taken down an elk. So we drove out there and set up our spotting scopes, and it was fascinating for weeks to watch all the different predators and scavengers just completely dismember this carcass and remove it. Grizzlies came, foxes, red foxes, coyotes, ravens, eagles. So these are just some sketches that gave me a feel for what early California might have been like. And we had even stranger predators that lived in California prior to about 150 years ago. Jaguars were reported in the 1800s, and they pretty much vanished as civilization grew. But there were jaguars native up all along the Colorado River, the lower Colorado River, in the cottonwood jungles that used to be there. And more interesting still to me, they were found in coastal oak woodlands from the Mexican border all the way up to here. San Francisco Bay Area had native jaguars, say 200 years ago. So here's a painting of a coast live oak woodland. This happens to be in the East Bay, but it could have been right here, and a jaguar. Sword ferns, poison oak, and jaguars. California condor is a really happy story of recovery of a really rare species that used to be abundant in California. Here's some sketches, and I was lucky enough in the 1980s, I was researching the book that long ago, to go down to the Los Padres National Forest and the edges and do some condor watching of the last wild condors. Back in the 80s, mid-80s, there were only something like 9 or 10 left in the wild because they had been either shot or they were eating deer that got away and had a lead bullet in them, and the condor would eat the carcass but get lead poisoning. So they were just dying. The Fish and Wildlife Service decided to make a decision that was controversial at the time of just trapping all the condors out and do a captive breeding program to try to just increase their numbers. So we would, from a really distant roadside perch, get our spotting scopes out, and watch as they would, these are little sketches, like, I think it was 10 miles away, the biologists would dig a pit, a hole in the ground, and put a little calf carcass that had been stillborn and donated by ranchers, and they would hide in this pit, and then they'd have some sort of mechanism to fire a net over the condor when it came and fed on the cow. So that is how they caught all the wild condors. But I was lucky enough to see some of the very last ones that had been truly lived their whole lives in the wild. But it's a happy story because the captive breeding program worked, and they've been reintroducing condors back into the wild, and they've been spreading. I think I saw on the news that one has flown into the edges of the Bay Area. I'm not sure where, but.
They were photographed up at the top of Mount Hamilton.
All right, great, yeah. So they're
San Mateo coast as well.
okay. So they're coming back. It's really interesting. So here's a sketch of back in the past, an elk carcass and condors feeding on it. When we were watching the condors back in the 80s, they seemed to have sort of a pecking order, and it wasn't a big messy fight like you see in TV documentaries with African vultures. You'd have a couple of dominant condors feeding, and everyone else had to wait their turn, including these huge golden eagles. And if a golden eagle came too close, one of the condors would jump over and open these huge wings that flashed black and white, and the eagle would just go running. So here's a painting that might happen in the future pretty soon, is condors, bald eagles up in the redwood rivers feeding on dead salmon. And salmon, that's a chapter that hasn't been as happy lately. Salmon are continuing to decline, and even with the drought, I've seen their emergency measures are being made to just try to save a lot of these salmon populations. But in the past, this is a painting of the Carquinez Strait, where the combined flow of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers pours through this gap in the Coast Range and out to the ocean. And in the past, you might have stood up here and imagined millions of huge 3 to 4 foot long salmon surging up through this gap and swimming hundreds of miles up into the far reaches of the Sierra Nevada. The main salmon of these big rivers like the Sacramento is the Chinook salmon. Here's a male and a female and eggs. And there's still a few places where you can see these wild big Chinook, they're big fish, spawn. This is a cold, clear tributary of the Smith River up by the Oregon border. And these dark little shadows there are these very big spawning Chinook salmon. The other common salmon that we used to have and is still with us but not as abundant is the coho salmon. And the beautiful red fish, the male, when it's in spawning colors. There's still a place that I used to go, and I think you can still go and see salmon, the coho salmon, is Lagunitas Creek in Marin County. This is where this painting was based on, and it's in the past. I have grizzly mother and cubs coming to feed on the salmon carcass. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's been a lot of, this is like a sketch of the salmon, it's called a red, where they sort of swish gravel away and build a nest, lay their eggs in the gravel. But they need a lot of oxygen in this gravel to have their eggs and the little tiny salmon fry survive. And what's been happening through the last century is clear cutting and poor road management even has allowed a lot of silt to just come and fill up that gravel and ruin a lot of really good salmon streams. So I went up to the Klamath River area, that's a rainbow trout, and talked with a lot of people there that were doing a really interesting job of coalitioning together, including Forest Service, native tribes, and residents, of trying to improve the entire watershed to bring back salmon. And they said to me, you don't start with the river, you start at the top of the hills and work with the forest. So you don't have overgrazing of the ridge tops, which causes siltation and erosion. You don't have clear cutting, which causes just mass wasting of slopes. So they were getting together trying to manage forests where you'd cut single trees and not overgraze, but they had a really interesting idea of working with the entire watershed, and it was working. They were having a good return of even like beavers. I think they were reintroducing beavers. So another chapter I have in the book is about our rich and abundant marshes, freshwater marshes, coastal marshes, seas, bays. This is actually near Hayward in the past, Hayward, Fremont area, freshwater marshes that had greater white-fronted geese, herds of elk. There was the bays had a lot of abundant fishes, little, very small fishes, sardines, anchovies, herrings, which at times attracted whales, fur seals, sea lions to feed on this incredible abundance. But there were stranger critters that lived off of California. The bones of the stellar sea cow have been found off of Monterey Bay, dated to about 18,000 years ago. And if anyone knows what a Florida manatee is, this is related to that, except this stellar sea cow was 30 feet long and weighed 10 tons. And it just floated around peacefully grazing on kelp. And then in recent times, last 10,000 years, it really likes cold water, so it retreated up to only being found around Alaska, off of the coast of Alaska. And it had sort of a sorry history because it was discovered to science in the 1700s, and then it went extinct about 5 years later because it was really handy to be eaten by sailors. So this is an extinct critter. There are some other strange birds. This was a giant petrel that was recorded by early ornithologists in Monterey Bay in the 1800s, and today it's only found in the southern hemisphere. So what was it doing in California? There's a lot of mysteries that when you look into history of California. This is an extinct diving goose that's related to scoters. However, it was flightless, and it went extinct about 2,000 years ago, so it wasn't modern civilization that caused this one to go extinct. But it lived bred on the Channel Islands and off Mexico. So after looking at some of the animals and the faunas, I wanted to concentrate on habitats. What were early ecosystems like in California? And my favorite was grasslands, because I learned that my house used to be a grassland in the El Cerrito Hills, very open, grassy place. So this was an interesting tug of war with the publisher, because the publisher, Heyday, did a really good job, but they said nobody's going to be interested in grassland, so we need to really shorten this chapter. And they had cut out so much of the book already. They'd cut out my desert chapters, the redwood chapter, the Sierra Nevada, so I kind of pleaded with them. I said, well, let's just keep the grassland chapter big, because nobody writes about it. It's sort of it needs more, boosters. So they did, they agreed. So fortunately, the grass chapter is pretty big in the book. So I went around trying to find all the relics of native grasses I could all over the state. Found they're kind of pretty common if you learn what to look for. And here's Los Altos, right here this is Silicon Valley, looking from the hills on the east side to the peninsula. This is what it might have looked like before San Jose, and the marsh had just a maze of channels entering the South Bay, and in the foreground is Stipa cernua, which is one of my favorite bunchgrasses. Now here's another story of the difficulties, the challenges. It's fun, but the challenges of publishing a book, especially a big book. So this is a reconstruction in the Diablo foothills, Mount Diablo area of California oatgrass, Danthonia californica, which is a really interesting grass to me because it often it grows really flat, like the stems don't grow upright. They'll often grow along the ground horizontally. And I always wondered what that was about. Maybe it was like an adaptation for avoiding grazing by elk. So I went out and I drew a lot of line drawings of all these different species of native grasses, which you can see in the book. And I drew this one horizontally. And then it took actually 4 years to edit my manuscript down. They cut, we reworked a lot of the writing, and at the end of 4 years, they sent me a PDF of the entire book designed as it would appear in print. And they said, Laura, go through and get all the errors, correct all the errors we have. So that was a big job. It was like 370 some odd pages, and so I spent quite a while going through getting some of the errors, but I missed 3 of them. There's 3 errors in the book. And one of them is the designer turned my Danthonia drawing vertical because they thought, well, that's how it grows. Even my text. So I saw that late, and I called up the editor and I said, well, can we move that back to horizontal? And they said, too late, it's off to the printer. But I'm probably the only person that cares, really, so it's okay. Here's some of the other line drawings. Here, Festuca rubra, the red fescue, and some more needle grasses. Here's some paintings of vernal pools, which so common in the Central Valley, and I've read some of the early botanical accounts that there were vernal pools in the Oakland flatlands too once. So here's another oil painting of the El Cerrito Berkeley Hills looking past Albany Hill to the Golden Gate. Just some of my sketches of finding native bunchgrasses and trying to do a little schematic drawings of what a prairie might have looked like. Some sketches, little field sketches and oil painting of wildflowers, including the introduced fillory. This was actually a commissioned painting by Steve Edwards of the Tilden Botanic Garden. They had a interpretive sign at Inspiration Point that they wanted to reconstruct the view eastward from Inspiration Point. So I worked with Steve Edwards, and he was pretty sure that in the past, before all the introduced wild oats and bromes, that it might have been just a carpet of amazing patchwork of colors, of poppies and lupins, and so that's a possible view looking east into the Coast Range. A line drawing of some grassland critters, coyote and a badger. Here's some field sketches of vole. The voles make little tunnels through bunchgrasses. When you find a patch of purple needlegrass, you can see these little tunnels through them. Elk grazing. And here's another oil painting of basically where my house would have been, looking out westward towards Mount Tamalpais in the past. And then sometimes in the book, I go back into the past a little further. This is a scene from the Ice Age about 20,000 years ago. And when they built the first Bay Bridge, they put these giant pilings down through the water and through the bay ooze and mud, and they hit bedrock, but they also hit bones. And they were fossils of these ancient large bison and prehistoric horses that apparently lived in the San Francisco Bay before it was a bay, because back in the Ice Age there was a lot of water locked up in northern continental glaciers, so the sea level was far lower and out to where the Farallon Islands are right now. And San Francisco Bay was a dry valley, and it was cooler and moister, so it probably had a lot of oaks, Doug fir, and it had these prehistoric horses and bison. That's Alcatraz Hill right there. So this is some of the megafauna that would have appeared in the Bay Area in the past, in the Ice Age. Another habitat ecosystem that's so important in the Bay Area and California is oaks. This is an oil painting of Ohlone women grinding acorns in a bedrock, I think it's like blue schist boulders in Berkeley. This is one of the Berkeley mortar rock parks, as it might have appeared in the past. And here's an oil painting of along the Sacramento River. In the summer, you'd have these jungles of cottonwoods and valley oaks draped with grapes, California grapevines. But in the winter, they might have looked like this, because before the age of dams and levees, a lot of the rivers spilled over their banks during the spring snowmelt and created these very large, shallow lakes that gave nutrients to the roots of the oaks. San Joaquin Valley today, this is a photograph I took of a cotton field. And in the past, it might have looked something like this, with Elymus triticioides just forming these giant rhizomatous acres and acres of mats. It's one of our native bunchgrasses native grasses that wasn't a bunchgrass. And then at valley oak woodlands over it. And when the Europeans first entered habitats like this, they were kind of amazed because it looked somewhat like their English gardens back in the old world. And they wondered, who is managing these oak areas in California? And they didn't realize there were people managing them. And I'll get to that in a bit. This here's Hetch Hetchy Reservoir today. In the past, it might have looked like this: California black oaks, ponderosa pines, sort of a similar valley to Yosemite. The desert, this is a part of the book that got cut out by Heyday. They just said this is, my manuscript was huge, so they just had to limit it. Flat-tailed horned lizard painting. This could be the subject of a future book. Desert tortoise. Some field sketches of tortoise. But after looking at the habitats of California and some of the more interesting animals, birds, what during my research really interested me the most was discovering about the ecological processes that shaped California through the thousands of years. Things like fire, flood, climate change. So the people who were managing those oak woodlands to make them look like English gardens were actually Native Americans who had a very complex system of burning all over the state. And they used low-intensity grass fires. They would burn under oaks to clear brush around, and it might have actually helped oaks to have less parasites in their acorns. I've talked to Native American elders in the Bay Area who said, we burned everything. So here's a Miwok man setting fire to a pickleweed marsh in the Bay lowlands. So a lot of California vegetation is actually fire adapted. Here's some chaparral. I did a quick sketch of a chaparral fire just as it was burning out and coating the ground with ashes. And a lot of chaparral plants either die and reseed, or they have these big underground root burrows, energy supplies and roots, and they'll resprout. Here's some oil paintings of a coast, or a blue oak savanna, and a very small intensity grass fire comes through it. And then afterwards, it looks a little dead, but I've even gone after some fires that happened when somebody just threw a cigarette out the window. And you go to these places, and to me the blue oaks looked dead, but I would come back 2 weeks later and they were sprouting leaves. So they really, if the fire's not too hot, they can survive it quite well. And the little green specks are actually in that very scene. There were purple needlegrass already, even in 2 weeks in October, flushing with new growth of leaves. So here's a painting in the southern Sierra Nevada foothills of, in the past, a native woman has come and burned this hillside, which has ceanothus, Lotus scoparius, this deerweed, interior live oak, and gray pine. And it was a low intensity fire, so it didn't kill the trees. And then she comes back 6 months or a year later, and a lot of the ceanothus grow these really long, straight stems after a fire. And she collects those, and they make excellent bows and arrows and fishing spears and basketry material. So they were apparently really actively managing a lot of the California landscape. And they would burn off grasslands to attract elk, because a new bunchgrass with green leaves is like ice cream to a lot of grazers. In the Mojave Desert, this is another part that could be a future book, got cut out. This is a creosote burr sage with a rain shower. Flood is another process that we haven't quite gotten control of in California, still very active in shaping things. For instance, in the 1860s, a huge flood covered the city of Sacramento majorly, and it was probably helped by a lot of the gold mining that even all the sediment flushed out of the foothills during gold mining probably raised the level of the rivers, helping more flooding happen. Here's a drawing on the left of the same stretch of the Sacramento River separated by 100 years. So 1874, and then mapped out in 1974, and you can see how it shifts. So all the boundaries of this river, they move.
Wow.
So on the right is, this yellow is the Central Valley, there's the Sierra Snowpack, the rivers, and before the age of dams, these rivers would overflow in good years with good snowpack and form these extensive lakes, shallow lakes that would sometimes last for years. One of them, Tulare Lake in the San Joaquin Valley. Here's an oil painting showing Yokuts Indians in their Tule balsa. The southern Sierra in the background, snow geese. They apparently would build Tule barges that were 50 feet long to get across this very large, shallow lake that would sometimes dry up, sometimes reform. It's completely gone now. This is all cotton fields. Here's San Bernardino today, just a picture I took of the freeways. And in the past, rivers came through here from the San Bernardino Mountains. Giant sunflowers, like 15 feet tall, grew. Kingbirds, western sycamore trees, sedge and rush marshes. It was quite a different scene. And climate is such a big topic. You could write a whole book on just that. But I was just going to briefly mention this interesting study that was done in the Tehachapi Mountains, where researchers took a blue oak woodland and did boreholes into the trunk to try to age the trees, count the tree rings. But in the process, they also could see the fire scars. They could count how many times a fire had swept through the woodland. And so they noticed that most of the trees in the forest actually dated to the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Like all the trees you see in the woodland were acorns, and then they sprouted at that time, and some earlier, but then they didn't sprout after that. Like we don't see a lot of oak reproduction after that time. It's a little bit of a mystery. So he tried to figure out, well, what's causing this lack of oak recruitment into adulthood? We're not getting saplings growing into trees in this area. And he noticed, well, that this is a good example of how complex California ecology is. It's quite fascinating, but sometimes it's hard to get the cause and effect. But he noticed in the 1850s and 60s, there was sort of a big shift in climate from what was called the Little Ice Age where glaciers were growing in the Sierra Nevada. It was a little rainier. And then we suddenly had the end of the Little Ice Age into our present kind of warmer, drier climate, right at about that time when the oaks suddenly could grow. But at the same time, he noticed in counting the fire scars ended right at the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, probably because at the same time, the Spaniards came in and kicked the Indians off the land, said, you can't burn it, and we're going to put cattle on what is now the Tejon Ranch. So all these different factors were happening simultaneously right in that period of time. And there's complex interactions because cattle will eat acorns and they'll browse down oak saplings, so maybe it was the cattle. Or was it this climate shift? Or was it the fire? Because fire, when it sweeps through a grassland, like those low-intensity grass fires, kill a lot of ground squirrels. And ground squirrels love to eat acorns. So when you stop the fires, you suddenly get an explosion in the ground squirrel population, which might be decreasing the oaks. So fascinating research. I mean, more should be done. And I think it's unanswered. So here, getting towards the end of this book and the program, this is my sister's attempt in Richmond, in the East Bay, to recreate what we think is an original grassland in her little hillside area. What did her house look like before the house? And so she's worked with Native Here Nursery a lot, used to work there in Berkeley. And so she goes out and does seed collecting, and we were even doing that this morning. So she got a lot of Clarkia. There's the Danthonia californica, the Stipa pulchra, and she did a really good job of recreating what we think is a great valley grassland with wildflowers and changes through the seasons. But then a couple of years ago, she got a knock on her door, and it was the city of Richmond. They said, we had a neighbor complain about the weeds in your yard. So you got to cut this stuff down. And it was interesting, I was asking her what happened this morning in more detail, and she said the city actually wrote a letter to them threatening to put a lien on their house unless they removed the weeds. So my sister fought back, and she wrote letter after letter saying, this is native habitat. It brings butterflies and birds, and I've spent years researching it. She got one of those Fish and Wildlife or National Wildlife Federation, habitat signs and put it in her yard. And it succeeded. She actually convinced the city of Richmond to back off and leave her alone. And she promised to sort of mow the grass. And we said, well, it'll be like elk, coming through. But she even convinced them, she said, I'm not going to mow it until the seeds ripen so I can collect them. And they said, okay. So she actually succeeded. And now all the neighbors on her street are exchanging seeds. And so we've got this whole little street going of a native grassland. It's great. So in conclusion, one more oil painting going back farther into the Ice Age in California. This is like 20,000 years ago. And this is even in the Bay Area. We had a state that was even more different than with grizzlies. We had Columbian mammoths, which were larger than African elephants, had these enormous tusks that were like 15 feet long, packs of saber-toothed cats, which would hunt baby mammoths. And then you had the largest North American land mammal predator that ever lived, the giant short-faced bear, which was 6 feet at the shoulder and designed to run. So it was a predator to be reckoned with when you were to hike out there. And it must have made the grizzly bear look tame. So that's the end of the program. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them, and thanks for inviting me.